Hi everyone! So today I'm going to be talking about boiling water bath canning as a way to preserve the bounty of your garden or the seasonal local harvest from farmers. Boiling water bath canning is just one of many ways you can preserve food. It's quite simple and easy, and you can make some really delicious recipes that'll make your harvest last all the way through the winter. I have a few examples of some things that I made this past harvest season to give you a sense of what's possible with boiling water bath canning. I made some salsa verde with tomatillos. I have some dilly beans, which are pickled green beans, some marinara sauce, rhubarb jelly, an apple coffee caramel, and I tried doing some pickled ginger peaches for the first time. So lots of different things that you can make. The one thing that all of these recipes have in common is that they are high acid foods. So a lot of people wonder, why can I boiling water bath can my jam, but I can't boiling water bath can salmon or soup? And that all has to come down to the acidity level. High acid foods are going to be 4.6 or lower on the pH scale, whereas low acid foods are going to be 4.6 or higher on the pH scale. In general, most fruits are going to be high acid, so berries and even apples, things that we think of as sweet, but they actually have quite high acidity. Those are all going to be safe to boiling water bath can without adding any extra acid. Things like pickles and chutneys and relishes and salsas, those have vinegar added, which is what is bringing their pH low enough that it's safe to boiling water bath can. So some examples of low acid foods, just to give you an idea of things that would need to be pressure canned, which we'll talk about in a different video, are things like salmon or game meat, any meat. If you're making a soup, if you're making a chili, if you're wanting to can just straight up vegetables like your carrots or your green beans or your squash from your garden, those will need to be pressure canned. So nobody is expected to know what the pH level of different ingredients are or of different recipes are, which is why it's really important that we just follow tested and trusted recipes when we're canning, because they'll have already tested for that safety. So there's 3 principles we're using that's helping us to preserve the food when we're boiling water bath canning it. One is that we're applying high temperatures for a specified amount of time. So your recipe is going to say for how long the processing time is for those particular ingredients. So let's say it's 10 minutes, for example. That means you need to be boiling your jar in boiling water at 100 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes. So by doing this, we're destroying microorganisms that's going to cause the food to spoil or rotten over time. The same thing is happening with the removal of air. So when your jar is in the boiling water bath canner, there's air bubbling out and being released, and then that vacuum seal that is created is making sure that there's not enough air or oxygen in the jar to allow your food to spoil. In the case of boiling water bath canning, we're also making sure we're processing naturally acidic foods or foods with added acid. And this is really important because boiling water bath canners will never get hot enough to destroy the bacteria that causes botulism. So this is a bacteria that caused a lot of scare with home food preservation in the past. It creates really gnarly symptoms that nobody wants to risk getting. So as long as your food is high acid, it is safe to boiling water bath can. If it is low acid, it needs to go in a pressure canner, because only a pressure canner can get to high enough temperatures to kill off the bacteria of botulism without also having added acid. So particularly if you're new to canning, always follow a recipe and do not alter any of the ingredients that might change the pH level of the recipe. So if you're, switching out a spice here or there, or just some flavorings, that's usually fine. But if there's a particular type of fruit or a particular vegetable, or especially the level of vinegar or any acid you're adding, do not tamper with it for the flavor, because it could also be impacting the pH level. As long as you follow a tested recipe, you'll be fine. And some sources for that I'll link below. But think about like government websites, think about university websites. A lot of them have guidelines and recipes for home food preservation. First Nations Health Authority put out a really good guide as a PDF a couple years ago, so you can find that on their website. And you can also get cookbooks. There's great cookbooks from, trusted sources, authors and chefs that are experts in food preservation. So this is one I really like. It's called Put 'Em Up by Sherry Brooks Vinton. And I really like it because it has all of the basics and principles at the beginning, so you can always review the principles of canning at the beginning of the book. And then it's all organized by the type of food or produce, so the fruit or vegetables. So if I have a bunch of cabbage, if it's cabbage season, I can go to that section. If I have a bunch of chilies, I can go to that section. And it's all foods that are typically available and grown sort of in the Pacific Northwest. Okay, so you have your recipe, you got all your ingredients. What equipment do you need now to boiling water bath can? I'm going to go over the equipment a little bit, and then we'll go over the actual process of canning. So first you need your canner. This is essentially just a very large pot. I got this one from Bernardin. It is great because it is massive, so you can do a lot of jars at the same time. You can even stack two layers of jars. So it might be worth investing in, or you may have a neighbor or a friend that you can borrow one from. Most people aren't using their boiling water bath canners on a daily basis. And if you are local here, if you're in Tofino, Ucluelet, Apitsit, Tyastanis, Esawista, the Tofino Ucluelet Culinary Guild also has a rental library. So you can rent out a boiling water bath canner or a pressure canner or a dehydrator for a week. You just have to plan a little bit ahead of time to know when you're going to need it. So really you can use any pot that you have in your kitchen. You're just gonna want it to be large enough to fit your jars. And so it depends how many jars you're planning on processing at once and what size of your jars. So an important thing to know is that the water level does need to be an inch above your jar. So this is going to allow for the heat and the water to be dispersed and circulated evenly. So as long as your pot can fit a jar and then still have an inch of water over top, that is large enough. You might just need to consider that when you're shopping for your mason jars or thinking about what recipes you're gonna do. You're gonna need to get the size of jars that works for the size of pot that you have. You're also gonna want, ideally, to have a rack. This one comes with the Bernardin boiling water bath canner, so it's a rack that sits at the bottom of the canner, and it essentially is for the same principle as having the inch of water above the jar, is just to make sure that the water and the heat is circulating evenly. And also by lifting the jar slightly off the bottom of the pot, you're gonna prevent the jars from cracking. There's just a higher chance that there's gonna be some thermal shock and the jars will crack if they're experiencing really hot heat from the bottom where the pot is actually touching the element. So having this rack helps prevent that. You don't need a rack like this. You might have something in your kitchen that looks similar, maybe like a cookie cooling rack or whatever you might have that fits in your pot that's heat proof. You can also use, and what I've done a lot in the past is create a layer of these rings. These are the canning jar rings. So if you imagine that you would layer them next to each other on the bottom of the pot, it creates almost this little shelf that does the same thing as the rack. So that's another option. Okay, you're also gonna want to have some tongs. So all of these pieces I'm about to show you, Bernardin actually sells them in kits, or they'll come with the rental if you're renting from Tofino Culinary Guild, and they're quite inexpensive, so it might be worth just investing in if you're gonna be planning on doing some canning in the future. So these tongs are really great. They're quite necessary because they're what you're going to be using to both lower your jars into the boiling water bath canner and then also take them out once your canning is done. Because of course, like, we're dealing with hot glass. We don't want to be trying to use other kitchen tongs where, you know, if it slips out, you're going to have hot glass and hot water splattering everywhere. So these are really great because they're actually made to fit around the mason jar and they have this rubber grip. We also have a funnel, which is made to fit inside the mason jar as well. So this is just really great when you're putting your ingredients into your jar, just to keep it tidy and prevent splashes and prevent losing food to your floor and counter. We have this little magnet, which is not really necessary, but it's pretty fun. So this is when you're going to be warming your lids, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, when you're putting your lids in hot water to warm them up and sort of soften this adhesive. This magnet's really handy to just kind of pull them out of the hot water so you don't burn yourself, and then pop it onto the jar. And then we also have this nifty tool, which is also not completely necessary but useful to have. This end can be used to help get any air bubbles out of the jar, out of what you're processing before putting the lid on and putting it in the canner. So we want to make sure to release any trapped air, because any oxygen is again going to contribute to your food potentially spoiling. So this is useful. You can use a chopstick, you can use a butter knife, you can use anything else. This side though has this little staircase with measurements, which is handy because each recipe for boiling water bath canning will tell you the amount of headspace that you need to leave. So that means the amount of empty space when you're filling up your jar that's left at the top between like where the food ends and where the lid is. And this is important to follow because if you leave too much space or if you leave too little space, either of those things can prevent the jar from properly sealing. You can imagine if you leave too much space, that's just too much air in there. If you leave too little space, when your jar is in the pot, the food's gonna be bubbling, it's hot in there, it might boil over and kind of get in the way of that seal. So these little measurements on this tool show like a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch, so that you can measure to what your recipe says, but you can also do that with a measuring tape. Okay, you're gonna need a jar. Mason jars have been made for this purpose of canning. You should always use mason jars. Don't use some sort of old glass jar that's in your cupboard from, you know, spaghetti sauce or whatever you got at the grocery store. You can reuse mason jars though. If you have mason jars in your cupboard, if your neighbor or your friend has mason jars, you don't need to buy new ones. you just want to make sure that there's no like chips or cracks or any faults like that if it is an older jar, because that's just going to contribute to your jar potentially cracking in the boiling water bath canner. You'll need lids. So new lids. If you're not buying a whole case of new jars that comes with the lids and the rings, you can just buy new lids in these packs. So this is the wide mouth ones. The smaller mouth jars come in the red packs. And you always want to have new lids because these are what is creating the seal on the mouth of your jar. So this kind of rust colored adhesive along the edge is this tacky seal that if it's been used before in boiling water bath canning, or if it's been, going in and out of your fridge or whatever, it could have degraded over time, and you want to be using new lids to make sure that you have the best chance of having a seal that's still going to be adhesive and it's still going to work. Then you're going to need a ring. So these rings can also be reused just like the jars. You just want to make sure that there's no sort of dents or imperfections in that way, and no rust, because these can get rusty really easily. So as long as they're clean, as long as they're in good shape, you can reuse the lids as well. So just a couple considerations when you're choosing your recipe. Recipes could be either raw pack or hot pack. So raw pack means that you're going to be taking your ingredients and putting it in your jar. So say if we're making pickled carrots, we're going to cut up our carrots, we're going to put them in the jar, and then we're just going to pour over our boiling vinegar solution. Hot pack is when you're actually kind of cooking a recipe before you're putting it in the jar. So if you're making tomato sauce, or if you're making jam or some sort of relish that you're cooking on the stovetop before putting it in your jar. So with raw pack, the benefit is it's less work at the beginning. You're not having to cook everything that you're putting in the jar. You're just warming up the brine or the water or the vinegar before pouring it in. But all of the vegetables or the fruits that you're putting in are just being put in raw. So it can be a bit easier. It can be a bit time saving. With hot pack, the benefits are that your food is getting cooked down a bit before you put it in the jar, so you can actually kind of fit more food in per jar, or more of your recipe in per jar. And you're also expelling some of that excess air that might be in the produce that you're using, which can contribute to spoilage. One of the things we're trying to minimize is the amount of air in the jar. Also, when you're cooking food before putting it in the jar, it's going to maintain a better color and it's not going to float in the jar as much. So say if you're packing like whole tomatoes, if you raw packed them, they might float, whereas if you cooked them and hot packed them, they would maintain their color better and they wouldn't float, which is really just more of an aesthetic thing for how the food is going to look in the jar, especially if you're giving it as gifts. But it doesn't really make a difference for how safe it is or for how long it's going to store for. Okay, so I'm just going to take you through the process a bit of what boiling water bath canning would actually look like when you're doing a recipe. So this is definitely something you're going to learn as you go. You'll get better at with practice. It'll become more intuitive. And yeah, it's really an experiential process. So I'll go through the steps here, but you can refer back to them when you're going through a recipe. And we'll also be posting some videos showing the process of going through a recipe, which we'll be able to show all the steps with a little bit more of a practical application. But we'll just go through it now just to get the basics down. So what I would first do once I get all my shopping together, I make sure I have the jars that I need, I make sure I have all the ingredients that I need for my recipe, is I would fill my boiling water bath canner. So I would get it filled about halfway full, and it depends if you're going to do 1 layer of jars or 2 layer of jars. You'll just sort of have to eyeball how much water you need in there. But remember, when you put in your full jars, the water level is going to rise. So you don't need the water level to be almost to the top to begin with. You want to make sure all of your jars are clean with soap and water. You have your new lids, your rings are clean with soap and water. And then what I usually like to do is actually put the empty jars into the boiling water bath canner as I'm bringing it up to temperature. So it is a bit of a myth, or rather, it used to be the recommendations, but the recommendations have been updated, that you don't need to sterilize your jars before processing them if the processing time is more than 10 minutes, which for me, it's been every recipe I've seen, the processing time is at least 10 minutes or more. So what I'm saying is that you don't need to pre-sterilize your jars in the dishwasher or in the oven, or by boiling them, as a lot of people that have been canning for a long time think you need to do that because that was the old recommendations. However, I still like to put my jars in the boiling water bath right from the beginning when they're empty, because one, it's giving them extra sterilization, why not? But also, if you put the jars in with the cold water and you bring them up to temperature with the boiling water bath, now they're going to be warm, they're going to be hot. So when I take them out and then I put my recipe and I put my ingredients in, I have these hot and warm jars that when I put them back in the boiling water, they're going to be much more less likely to crack. If you have cold jars, say if your house is a little bit cold, or the jars have been stored out in the shed, or if they're significantly cooler than the boiling water, it's very likely that they're going to crack when you start processing them, and that's going to be really sad because you put all this effort into making your recipe and getting everything ready, and then it just all goes out into the water. So we really want to prevent that thermal shock by making our jars warm before packing them with our recipe. All right, so jars are in there, the water is getting up to boiling temperature. That can actually take a while, so that's why it's good to do at the beginning. And then while that water is coming up to boiling temperature, then you can prepare the rest of your recipe. You can make your jam, you can cut up your vegetables, whatever you need to do. So then you're going to take the jar out with your handy tongs. So if you've done what I do and you put it in the water to begin with, you're going to take it out and dip out all that water that's now going to be in the jar back into the canner, and you're going to fill up your jar with whatever you've made. So let's say we made salsa verde. We're going to put it in our jar. We're going to make sure that it's filled to the proper amount of headspace, so a 1/4 inch or an inch or 1/2 inch, whatever the recipe says. If there's anything left over after that, that just goes in your fridge. That's just for you to eat right away. Don't fill, the last jar half full and think that you can still can that. If there's anything left that's not filling the jar to the proper amount, that just goes in the fridge, or that's just what you're going to be eating right away. So now that our jars are filled to the appropriate level, we're going to take our little tool again, or our chopstick, or whatever we have, and just kind of look around and make sure there's no air bubbles that we can kind of help gently remove by just kind of poking the stick around. So just make sure there's no air bubbles, because those can actually just stay trapped in there during the canning process, and then that's just more likelihood that the food is going to spoil while it's on the shelf, because it has that little air bubble to help contribute to bacteria growth. All right, so our jar is filled to the appropriate amount. We've gotten rid of the air bubbles. Now we're just going to want to take a cloth, a damp cloth, and just go around the rim and just make sure that there's no kind of spillage or no food there, because that's where the seal of your lid is going to go onto, that top part of the rim. and we want to make sure there's nothing sort of obstructing that seal. In the meantime, I'm going to be juggling a few things. You would have put the lids in some hot water. So what I usually do is I'll boil the kettle and I'll put the lids just in a little bowl, and I'll just pour the boiling water into the bowl. So it is boiling hot water, but I'm not boiling the lids in boiling water. You used to boil these lids in boiling water. That was part of the process, was to actually boil the lids before placing them on. It's not recommended to do that anymore. They've changed the recipe of this adhesive, and it can actually be detrimental if you boil it. It'll make it less likely that it'll seal. So just place it in hot water, because that's gonna soften up this adhesive and just help with that sealing process. So the lids are in hot water. We're gonna take our magnet if you have one. If not, just figure out another way to get them out without burning yourself. And we're gonna take the lid out of the hot water and place it on our jar. Do I have a lid that's the right size? This one's the right size for this jar. In case you don't know, there's two standard size lids for mason jars. So there's the wide mouth, and then there's I think they call this the standard size. So you just want to make sure that you have the right match of the size jars with the size lids. So this is the standard size, and you place your lid on there, and then our rings we're gonna screw on, and we're just gonna make sure they're what we call finger tight. So we don't want to crank it on as hard as we can, because that's gonna make it that when it's in the boiling water bath canner, those air bubbles can't actually escape and come out of the jar, which is what we need to happen. If we put it too loose, well, then water is gonna get in, or it's just gonna come off completely. So the general rule is to do it what we call finger tight. So it's on there, but it's not cranked on there. All right, you have your jar. It's all ready to go in the canner. Take your tongs. You're gonna lift it in. It's in the canner. Canner should be, the stove should be off right now, so you're not putting a jar into boiling water, but it's hot. It's almost at the boiling level. So once your jars are all in there, turn the heat back up and get it boiling again. Once the water starts boiling, that's when you're gonna start your timer. So for whatever the processing time is. So say if it's 10 minutes, when you see the water actually boiling again, that's when you're gonna start your timer, and you wanna keep it boiling at that 100 degrees Celsius for the full processing time. So let's say it's 10 minutes again, keep it boiling for 10 minutes. If for whatever reason, say if you turn it down a bit because it's really boiling, and then you notice, oh shoot, I turned it down too much, and it stops boiling at any point, that's fine. But just make sure you bring it back to a boil, turn the temperature back up, and then restart your timer when it starts boiling again. It's important that it maintains that consistency of 100 degrees Celsius for however long the processing time is. Okay, so you've done your 10 minutes. You can just turn the oven off, put the pot aside, like if you can just push it onto the element that's not hot, or just let it sit for a few minutes, just so it's not boiling anymore when you're taking the jars out. So once the water is kind of settled, once it's safe to go in there and take out the jars with your tongs, you can lift them out. Now, it's super tempting. There's gonna be like a little bit of water on top of here. And it's really tempting to want to kind of tip the jar and take that water off as you're taking them out of the boiling water bath canner. Don't do that, because these jars haven't necessarily sealed yet. So when you're tipping it, there could be liquid or food that's getting in between that seal that's going to prevent it from sealing. So resist the temptation, just carry it straight out. know where you're going. I like to put a little tea towel down on my counter, and you're gonna need to leave them there for 24 hours. So make sure it's not somewhere that you're gonna need to move them. And then the towel's good because these jars they're wet, so it's nice to have a little bit of a towel there. So take them out, put them down straight, and then you're just gonna leave them for 24 hours. In this time is when they should seal. They'll usually start sealing like quite quickly, and you'll start hearing this like pop, pop, pop. That's the sound of the jar sealing. It's a beautiful sound. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's sort of this sound like when you'll see on your lids, there's kind of this curvature, or this little button at the top. And that's how you're gonna know and be able to test if your jars have sealed after 24 hours. So you wanna leave them there for a bit because often they're actually sealing during that time that they're cooling down. So they're not expected to be sealed as soon as you take them out of the boiling water bath canner. Just leave them. After 24 hours, you can go and test if they've sealed. If you push on the lid and it makes a sound like this, and you can feel that the middle can still go up and down, then it's not sealed. If the lid is like flat and flush, this one's dusty, but if it's flat and flush, then it's sealed. And also, like, if I try to just gently pick this up, I can't. So that's how you'll know. If there's some jars that haven't sealed for whatever reason, sometimes you do everything perfectly and you think you do everything perfectly and they still just don't seal. It's not a big deal. That food's still great to eat. It's still, fresh. You just processed it the day before, so you can eat that right away. You can put it in your fridge. Just don't leave it on the shelf. If a lot of your jars don't seal, or you just want to make sure that they all sealed, the ones that didn't seal, you can just reprocess them. So there's no reason why you can't just, say if this jar hadn't sealed, I would just want to get a new lid, because this lid has already gone through the process of being boiled, and it might just be a faulty lid anyways because it didn't seal the first time. So I want to get a new lid, but I can use the same jar, the same ring, and just put it back in the boiling water for whatever the processing time is. The last thing you want to remember after all of this is done is just make sure to label your jars. So you might think you'll remember what you made a year ago, but you probably won't, or you won't remember when you made it. It's always just a good practice to label them right away. So like this one, I put, I didn't have any labels left, so I just wrote in Sharpie on the lid, Salsa Verde 2020. I should have put the month, but I'll know it's when tomatillos were in season. This one, I had the labels that come when you buy the packs of mason jars. Apple Coffee Caramel, May 2020. So yeah, always label your jars, and then make sure to store them in a dark, dry, cool space where the temperature is not going to be fluctuating a bunch. This is just best practices to try to maintain the quality of your food as long as possible and just avoid any spoilage. In general, we really want to try to go through any of our canned foods within a year. That's when their quality is going to be the best, but often they will keep for much longer than that. All right, thank you for watching. Let us know if you have any questions at all about these basics and principles of boiling water bath canning. You can also check out the resources that we've posted below, and remember that you can rent this equipment from the Tofino Ukilet Culinary Guild. So there's no need to invest a lot, especially if you're just starting out or trying this out for the first time. And ask your neighbors, ask your friends. They might have a canner you can borrow, and they might have some recipes to share. Happy preserving!